Virtuality. Okay. When we talk about virtuality, we mean a collaboration or working together through information communication technologies, which creates temporal and spatial distanciation between individuals or teams. And so we can have different arrangements. Some disarrangements might be modular, where people might not interact that much. They're still kind of remotely located, but or they might use different technologies and platforms, varying from emails to video conferencing technologies to currently something that's really gaining momentum is the augmented immersive realities and new devices. And so this theme of research has been going for many years. My take on it is, again, more looking at workplace interactions, organizational perspectives on this process that take place in organizations. At the same time, when we talk about workplace interaction organizations, there's this that's been going on for many years, but also in broad discourses, this move away from understanding human behaviors as rational and positivistic models of explaining what it is to be a human being as a thinking thing, but rather kind of focus on the embodied, right? Collaboration, workplace interactions as body work, which also lend itself to think about, to understand the messiness of organizational interactions, to think about human interactions, the sentient and the affective aspect, the emotions that take place. So we have these two aspects, right? So we have the virtual interaction at the same time understanding organizational relationships, workplace relationships are very much embodied, not in a normative sense, embodied just the body being there, but really the body shaping productive relationships, being actively involved in this process. And so normally an important part for understanding and thinking about the virtuality of workplace, of organizations, of interactions should involve thinking about what is the situation of the body in this context. And there are different claims and perspectives. How can we think about the body in this virtual context? And they date back to cyberpunk literature. And this is a very broad brushstroke introduction, right? But I think it captures well some of the main trends. So we have the utopian where the body is seen as this liability, as this burden that we can get rid of by having this technological virtual way of being with others, all right? And so the flesh, which is almost kind of seen in derogatory terms, and currently this is projected in ideas of transhumanism. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but it's about mind uploading and theorizing what it might be when this virtual being takes over and we get rid of our bodies. Similarly, we have claims about destroying time and space and having the seamless communication and so on. And so on the other polar end of this continuum are more dystopian views, which would be usually associated with more engineering, probably perspectives of techno-skepticism, right? So the virtual would be this inauthentic, something that is much inferior than the face-to-face, the real. It cannot replicate this gold standard of, and face-to-face would be really, and it is in a way the authentic mode of being with others, but there will be constant comparing and thinking about technology as something that cannot really mediate, for instance, the non-verbal, the facial cues and so on. And what's really characteristic about this polar end of the conversation is that it's very techno-deterministic, meaning that a lot of the inferior outcomes of virtual interactions would be attributed to the technology, to the characteristic of technology, not so much how technology is used and so on. And so within this field, there are phenomenology authors that have been very formative in my kind of development as a researcher, such as Hubert Dreyfus, who would also try to apply some of the work of, for instance, Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty to this area, who would suggest that mediated interactions, online virtual interactions would be inferior, and pretty much because the body is mediated, we cannot experience the risks that we would otherwise experience when we're embodied in the world, the vulnerability of our body. We cannot have a grip of the world, and we cannot experience moods. In a similar vein, Thomas Fuchs would be talking about empathy and how we can develop online empathy, and his argument would be that it's more imaginative. It's there's this imaginary other which doesn't, which makes this interactions and empathizing less real, less authentic. The problem with these authors, I think, is if at least my take on it is that they stay truthful to the source of their inspiration, whether it's all the phenomenological authors, whether it's Husserl, whether it's Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger. But I think any of these sources, they don't provide much of a sense of how can we think about this interface between technology and the body, right? So neither Merleau-Ponty nor Heidegger have been theorizing the digital age and how these digital technologies work. And so many of these authors really, they don't provide much of empirical insights into some of their claims. So at the same time, we have a lot of studies in broader organizational social sciences, let's say, where we see cases of very successful, very productive interactions virtually, exclusively virtual interactions that work well, people claiming that we have a proper, normal lived experiences of interacting with others. They might be different, qualitatively different from face-to-face, but we can experience emotions, we can sustain relationships with others. So there is even research that showing how intimate relationships can be developed and sustained through virtual interactions. Even authors that claim that we can have more real relationships through technology than in collocated settings. And so there's almost kind of this paradoxical findings here, right? How can we explain for these polar takes and explanations of virtuality? And so more recently, there are perspectives on technology that suggest that what's really important here is this interface between the technology and the human beings, right? It's not so much technology per se, but how it's being used. And the ideas of affordances or new materialism, where the idea would be that there is no this distinction between embodied and disembodied, but rather there's entanglement that bodily and technological agencies, they come together, they intertwine, and therefore it's normal to have these different modes of working, interacting, collaborating both virtually and of course they might overlap. So my take, though, on this issue is to go a step back and think about, before we start thinking about this interface between the body and technology, to see what we mean by the body. How can we think about the body in this context? And then kind of try to think about this virtual embodiment. How can we think about it? And so I draw on the work of Merleau-Ponty. And so Merleau-Ponty is a French phenomenologist who's been whose main work is been published in the 40s and 50s. So his idea of intercorporeality implies that there is interconnection between bodies. That's which is essential part of being in the world with others. It's almost kind of being with others is also very much Heideggerian take on things, but here the claim is that the world is very much constituted by this intercorporeal armature. This is interworld, which is very much constituted by this intercorporeal armature, which is upon which we can really have more purposeful, task-oriented interactions. And so from that perspective, then the body is more than the physical, it's more than the sensual entity. And one way that Merleau-Ponty suggests it's about this interconnection. There are these two dimensions to the body, and which is the body schema and the body image. So the body schema is the distributed agency, the plastic and the flexible distributed agency that forms our lived experience, that is through which we can really experience the world and have it's related to proprioception, to how we experience the world and our movements in it. It can be seen as the body for me. And then the body image is the more the noetic, the conceptual, the specular understanding of our body, right? The body image, which is more symbolic representation of our own kind of experience. And these two dimensions of the body, their relationship is very important. It's almost it's very dynamic as well. So if for instance, in University of Heidelberg in Germany, the group of Thomas Fuchs is looking to explain and kind of theorizes different psychiatric pathologies by looking at how this relationship between body schema and body image is enacted in different conditions, but also we can think about the phantom limb or the rubber experiment, which also kind of suggests that this is something that's very formative of what it is to be a human being. And so, but what's important about this theorization of the body is that it opens and makes the body porous in the way we become human beings. Because the body image for Merleau-Ponty is something that we obtain always through the other. It's impressed by others. So we go out of ourselves. We are not identified with our physicality, but we kind of see ourselves only in interactions with others. We can take a stance on ourselves and through engagement. So the other becomes a mirror for us. So in a way, we are always already virtual and transcending the physicality that we have. And so this dynamic connection here is important, and it's a very specific in a way that it's reversible. So reversible is it's not about coinciding, it's about a middle way between the synthesis and division. It's the best way to kind of think about this is to have our hands touch each other, and it's a sense of touching and being touched at the same time. But still, this experience is not about coincidence. It differentiates and unifies the touching and the being touched. And so this is very much how we interact with others, right? How we perceive ourselves by being seen by the other, and then react and this experience, and there is always chasing between these touching or seeing and being seen, or affecting and being affected. And so this shows that what used to be a human being again is and being embodied is about this dynamic intertwining between self and other, and through the process of image, the movement between image and body schema. And so we experience ourselves, we have this lived experience only through the other. We're always kind of open and porous to the other. So the social becomes primary to the individual, and so this is a claim that's been made by many people already. So from this perspective, then, the solipsistic understanding of the being is very much problematized. Thinking is not something that is born in the head. It's always more kind of a dialogic, even in the quiet moments where we can reflect on philosophical texts. It's always we have a particular silent, present, or other that we kind of have this tacit dialogue in our heads with ourselves. Language here is not so much about this propositional denotative functions of the language, but what's important for Merleau-Ponty is the gestural aspect of language. Language is not giving form of our thoughts, but it's accomplishing them. But also it making things explicit. What really is important here is that it's not so much the representational understanding of language, but part of this movement between self and other. So then what can we, again, this is a brief introduction. I think we can, if you have questions, I can further provide, try to give more details, but what can we take away from this brief introduction into intercorporeality, then that the body that we understand is more than physical. It's more than it's material-semiotic process, right? It's more than just some entity, but it's a process between image and body schema. It's between self and other. It's a circular. It's more. It resembles circular movement through which we can enact different cells and different subjectivities as well. And so the body, then, these kind of movements, they're very much about ostensive practices. It's something that we show through our movement, through our interactions. We develop, we show, we display ourselves, and which is very important for developing this intercorporeal armature. So this would be very constitutive of process of positioning, orienting, and so in this context of dynamic process thinking, kind of moving from the more entitative understanding of the body to processual, technology would be very different. It won't be so much of this mediative entity but it'd be more constitutive, right? Be kind of constitutive context in which we can body forth with others. And so one way to think about, now I'm gonna try to illustrate some of these insights through a case that I've been exploring, which is an outsourcing case. But the difficulty with this perspective is how can be operationalized really to a context where most of the interactions are very much about mundane and propositional context. And my focus here is on digital text, right? There are different types of virtual relationships, and oftentimes they involve different communication channels. It might be emails, it might be video conferencing, it might be other platforms. My focus here is in a case that mostly was taking place through exchanging of emails and some Skype meetings. And so this case is about an outsourcing relationship between two companies, Indian and Irish, which this relationship was exclusively virtual. So people really never met in face-to-face interactions. What was really important here is that it was a knowledge-intense production process where the participants had to develop software. There was intense sense-making process of developing mutual understanding, which required a lot of interactions, a lot of thinking, a lot of clarifying, getting on the same page. And so my approach was, first of all, kind of going and analyzing the email exchanges, but also doing some observations and interviewing them. And this has been ongoing research, longitudinal research for over 2 years. So again, my experience there was that a lot of the interactions and a lot of the actual content of their emails were not so familiar to what they mean, but these were very technical emails and they're trying to make sense of things. And then I had this experience of struggling to see how can we really apply this Merleau-Pontian perspective. The body, talking about the body was an issue because no one would really think about their bodies in such context. The body withdraws, right? So it all kind of also brings some awkwardness to the conversation if one bring the topic of the body in this context. So one way I found it very useful to sensitize to what's going on in this process was think about dancing as dance as a very good example of intercorporeal relationship, right? So we have positioning of people, developing particular proximity, synchronizing rhythm, pace, and eventually developing some comfort with the other, right? Patterning of these movements in a way that they'll be always changing, they'll be always dynamic, and these patterns almost overwriting the individual agents, right? It's becoming a sort of mutuality that'd be difficult to be controlled by one of the dancers. And so thinking about the dance, which wasn't visible again in the interactions, I identified this three processes of co-presencing, co-orienting, and co-investing. So I was asking myself, how do they develop this sense of when to be, how much they should be visible, how much they should be oriented and are ready to engage with the others. To what degree, how do they develop this level of proximity and care and engagement with the others? These were somehow developed, and I had all the interaction. I was observing. It was very difficult to understand how they came to develop this armature, this sense for the other that really then grew into a very mutual and productive camaraderie, moods of trust and care for the other. And they were really happy to talk about how well they felt about this process and how much they were invested in it. And still, it was just very trivial interactions of exchanging emails, and sometimes they would talk about some personal things, but that was it. So what came to be really small and trivial gestures and acts of working with each other that seemed to be very important, and accumulating them together, they seemed to kind of give me some picture of what was going on there. And it was, for instance, things like how quickly you would respond to the other, how much time you're going to give to the other, how much even some of these acts involved not necessarily actual, but offering help and showing care for the other. And all this was mostly happening through digital text, which was usually is considered a very disembodied medium of interaction. And so when we think about this email interaction collaboration, which was again the primary medium of interaction, it wasn't so much about the transmission of discrete messages, but it was about doing the digital text, doing the language, the speed, the rhythm, the force, the frequency, all these things. And these were, I was able to identify the patterns and see how this changed over time. But this was really something that mattered here. And this presented a different way of thinking about language and especially digital text. So in some cases, we can think about people saying, well, you need to interact, you need to say things, even if you don't have anything to say. So using this propositional denotative function of the language, just to be there, to be present, to be engaged. Or new doings of language would be, for instance, flatteries or normal gestures that we can see in collocated settings, but they'll have a very different significance where, for instance, the acknowledgement of an email and actually there was a later on in the relationship started deteriorating, and there were small comments like, well, it's an email that really failed, not responding to an email that failed us, and it showed that these small gestures of something that would take for granted in more collocated settings really had a very different significance in these virtual settings. Or doing through language, where how much time you're going to spend, how much care and attention you're going to pay to the other in terms of that shape, the dynamic of interactions was also very important. It wasn't so much the propositional content, the linguistic, the semantics, but it was more the meta communicative aspects of these interactions. And then there were, as a process that involved a lot of textual artifacts, as the software development process. It was very important. I used a bit the work of Châtelet that use this, understand this textual as the inscriptions of diligence, of effort, which was manifested in the length or the quality of this document. So they were what I kind of see them as this frozen doings through language. So this is again a brief illustration of my way of seeing how this good productive relationship was really developed and emerged in this intercorporeal armature, where many of these things were not discussed, right? The rhythm, how much you care about the other, or how much you're out there for them. These were not discursively discussed. They were not part of the interactions. So again, as thinking about the dancing together, we don't discuss how much who's gonna lead, or how much you're gonna lead towards the other, or what would be the proximity. Just you engage in this process of dancing, and the body somehow navigate and respond to the solicitation of the others. And this was again something very similar happening here through the way they were producing this digital text and how they were interacting. That wasn't, I think, in many cases when I tried to ask and talk about this, it seemed to be not really consciously realizing what was going on. So, so what this means then for thinking about virtual embodiment, right? So we can think about this expansion of the body beyond the physicality and rematerialization of embodiment, right? So we can think about these displays and gestures and that manifested particularly, that were forms and modes of showing and displaying that through technology, through email. That was very important. So it's something that Merleau-Ponty says it's almost the symptoms of the disease is the disease itself. And very much here, these gestures and displays and thinking about this dynamic relationship between the body schema, body image, and self and other, that seem to be very much what we can call a body, right? It's a virtual embodiment which is expanded beyond the collocated and expanded through rematerialized in a particular new ways of displaying through technology. Again, this virtualized intercorporeality, it has a particular distinct features. We can see that, for instance, reversibility that we have in a sense of touching and being touched is slightly different, because in this context, getting in touch or kind of connecting with other doesn't necessarily mean that they would react. It doesn't mean, so there's this gap in the reversibility of engagements that is important, how they dealt with it. Oftentimes when we think about body and technology, we use this idea of prosthetic extension, right? So the senses are being prosthetically extended, and this issue has been problematized. I think McLuhan is also kind of questioning this, that there's some transformation or redistribution of the senses. Merleau-Ponty giving this example, the blind man with the cane, is where it's his sense of the world is being extended to the tip of the cane. But I think in this case, it's much more complicated if you think about intercorporeality, right? So if you have the other and in this intersubjective negotiation of space, for instance, a blind man, we're gonna probably see about the other signaling by making a noise with the shoe just to signal to the blind man that there is a passerby, and there will be much more complicated negotiation. So I think there's this transformative, this probably different set of practices in virtual context that we cannot really simplify to the with this prosthetic extension. Then we also have the hybridity of body and technology from new materialistic perspectives. And by new materialism, I mean mostly Karen Barrett and her ontological inseparability between body technology, human technology, down to epistemologies, which is a good way to kind of think about virtuality and the body and the intertwinement and entanglement. But then the question is, what is the body? Everything then becomes the body in this kind of technological world. And we still lack a bit more discriminatory treatment, understanding how can I think about the body, right? If everything's amalgamated, entangled, intertwined. And the question is, and this kind of leads me to draw a bit on Bateson, who would make similar claims, saying that we cannot not communicate, right? All our actions, all kind of displays and gestures can display something to the other. So we always kind of have this communication. And he distinguished between this analog and the digital. And I think the digital is the binary, is discrete message. It's a cold or warm. There are no the degrees. There are no missing the magnitudes, the ranges. Whereas the analog is more associated with the embodied with the ranges, with the magnitudes of, for instance, it's very difficult to explain, and the digital is very much related to the language. But it's very difficult to explain pain or feeling with words, right? It's something that we have this embodied and lived experience, which is very analog, and it's very difficult to. So I think analog and digital might help us to go beyond this hybridity of body and technology, and thinking how can we think about the embodied and the linguistic in this virtual context. And apparently it's not, there are overlaps between the analog and the digital, but I think this is a good way to move this conversation a bit forward. Thank you for this. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm really interested to hear what you think and any questions or comments that you might have. So I'll stop sharing now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Simeon. That was a lot. I have so many questions, but I first wanted to go ahead and just once again put forth this idea that the chat box is there for anybody to, engage, speak with each other, etc. But a specific question for Simeon, if you could please put it in the Q&A box, and I will go ahead and read those out. So while people are potentially thinking up questions to put in the Q&A box, I'm wondering if I can ask you a couple.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. There was one, in speaking to your methods, your methodologies, I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. You actually talked about struggling to quote unquote see Merleau-Ponty's ideas in these texts. Like you said, people didn't talk about their bodies. So, and then you had to move into this idea of dancing that somehow allowed you to then quote unquote see what you couldn't before in the data. I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, like your struggle first to quote see the body and how you recognize that, and how you found these other conceptual tools to help you.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question, and it's always a big struggle when it comes to responding to reviewers and trying to have a convincing argument. But I think that to start, the difficulty was with, again, this very different perspective on the body, right? So, and we are so much shaped and configured to think about the body as, you know, the physical and the physicality of the body, and then the sensual part, and the perspective of Merleau-Ponty doesn't necessarily kind of conveys that, or at least partly conveys. So it's so when it comes to virtual, it's somehow intuitively appealing to think about, well, but where is the body there, right? To have this kind of disembodiment argument. And so the way I had to do is to provide a lot of evidence by doing some analysis of, first of all, starting with the idea that, well, there was a predictive relationship there, right? So there was a predictive relationship that somehow they were experiencing emotions, moods, which means that there was a body, but the body wasn't just you know, we are always embodied. We always sit behind the screens and in front of screens, and we always kind of get affected, right? And we can get affected by a song on the radio, and it can get us emotional, or some news can get us emotional. And that was okay, but my kind of goal was here to say, well, but it's not just how we get affected, but how we affecting others, and how is this actually working? How is it working that they really develop such a caring relationship? How is it that they never really discussed, for instance, they never really negotiated explicitly their proximity in the relationship, right? How much they would be involved with each other, how much they would be there for the other. And this seemed to be something that I had to start exploring in the almost kind of meta communication of the patterns of interaction. So, for instance, like a speed of response and time. And so I had many graphs that were really useful. In a way, they showed how the relationship, they visualized the relationship on continuum. Still, the body wasn't there. Still, the body was. So the claim here was that, well, these are gestures and displays that are visible only through such a meta-communicative analysis, right? Relational communication is difficult to capture because there are these magnitudes which are very small. They seem very trivial, but they, once you kind of try analyzing it, you kind of, and quantifying it was easy. It started kind of showing a very different picture, right? It started providing an explanation of how they actually managed to develop this kind of small gestures and displays that actually, I didn't mention that, but the relationship between these two, I kind of focused on the first project, but there was a second project, and the second project completely failed. They ended in a commercial dispute was amenable to comparing and contrasting and seeing, okay, what were the displays and gestures that were there in the first and were not there in the second project, which then was very helpful, actually, this contrasting, comparing, and looking at the actual gestures. Is that would I can't hear you now because you're muted?
I'm sorry, I muted myself. No, thank you for that, because you say things like, I had to find the patterns. They weren't obvious. And where were the patterns? You say words like trivial, small, gestures. And to me, that's really interesting, because you have to, this is in nursing as well. You know, you're not looking for the obvious as a way to find the path forward. And so maybe this is just my own personal interest. It sounds like you almost had to do the same thing in your struggle to find analytic, touch points that would give you, the body configured through text. Yeah, exactly. And so it was very anthropological approach, right? Kind of looking at the nitty-gritty and the things that you wouldn't pay attention to, that though in many cases it was significant. And of course, one of the things that was very helpful is that we all have the experiences of interacting with remotely located people, and we all, for instance, get stressed when we don't get a response on an important email. We start wondering, and sometimes people would go and
explore if these people have online presence in other media, and that would explain why they might or they might not. And so we all struggle. And so my own experience was very telling as well, and helping. And again, some of these gestures and displays, they're much more visible in other platforms, for instance, social media like Twitter and Facebook. You have a lot of this attention and care, and the things, the signaling is made more explicit because you have different features and functionalities that are used in different ways. So all this ecology of technologies and how we use them, and my own experience were helping here to kind of figure out what was going on and how these kind of bodily interactions are acted out. Of course, it's still difficult, I think, if you listen to the story, to say, but where is the body here, right? Why do you call this body? Why this is disembodied? But again, I think it's difficult to tackle this in a directly.
I hear you. We have a question, so let me ask that, and then we can move maybe back or forward from what we were just talking about. Somebody asks, can you say more about the differences between analog and digital experiences? Are our co-constitutive relationships with analog versus digital technologies different? And if so, in what ways?
Okay, no, that's a very good question. So again, this is something that I've been thinking about how to move forward. Again, if we follow this idea of the new materialist perspective, where everything's already ontologically inseparable, and also through our interactions, we develop these agential codes, and we develop boundaries between humans and technologies and so on. It's very difficult then to distinguish between the bodily and the non-bodily, right? So we have this representational uses of language, which are very symbolic, and we cannot really think about them as bodily actions. So how can we then move forward? And so again, I've been always interested in Gregory Bateson's work. He's an author of the meta communication, and really I find his work very insightful. But came more recently this distinction between the analog and the discrete. So it comes from the way computation works, right? So we have, for instance, if you have a digital clock, which would show just the number, right, the digits, whereas a mechanical clock would show the hour hand, and there will be some ranges, right? It won't show exactly. It might be somewhere in between the minute or the show range. So what then in this case is that language is usually seen as and this would explain why in some cases, why is it that they never really in this interaction discussed explicitly their relationship, right? Like again, if you think about the dancing, we don't dance together by giving each other direction when we just engage in this event. So the way you squeeze the hand of your partner would be something that communicate, and how much you squeeze and how much they will react, and how much so it's all about the analog is more the magnitudes that you kind of may convey, you can express, which is associated with the bodily, right? So in our case, it was, for instance, the speed of the response and how much time you're gonna give. Of course, there were more discrete aspects of that were also important, and we can be associated with the digital, like gestures, such as, for instance, thanking and acknowledging the receptive females, that were not analog expressions, but they were still important. But I think what was really important is this, again, the dancing and the negotiation of magnitudes, of ranges, of who's gonna lead and how much gonna lead, and the rhythm, or the speed of movement, and all these are being negotiated through the bodily, and that this is associated with the analog. So I think Masumi is developing these ideas, but I wouldn't be able to talk more on this topic. I think it is, again, in this case, the analog is showing really the bodily aspects of in virtual interactions, but it's not just about the analog. I think there are many discrete messages that were supporting the analog engagement. So I think there is definitely there is now this dualistic treatment between analog and digital. So I don't know if that's answering somehow the question, but at least kind of adding a bit more, giving a bit more details in my kind of thinking on it.
And the person, it's Gregory Bateman, right?
Bateson.
Bateson, yeah, okay, Bateson here, hold on, somebody is asking about, how do you spell his last name? I'm forgetting, I'm blanking.
Bateson.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I've got that to everybody now. When you were just talking about that, you differentiated discrete, the discrete versus, kind of a range or the in-between. And that was something that I heard you talking about as well when you were thinking about the text messages. You were saying these small gestures, these small little trivialities, they weren't really quote unquote message. It wasn't like a discrete transmission of information. It was more about dynamics, frequencies and rhythms. Could that be another way of looking at the idea between analog and digital? This, the discrete 0-1 versus the, rhythm and frequency of 0 and 1, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I exactly. So if you think about, for instance, the loudness of the voice can be a very analog thing, right? How much the volume that you kind of have. But when it comes to the virtual and to the email exchanges and to the discrete messages, I think you can still probably use some of these discrete messages on a continuum. If they can form a pattern that might not be within one act, like the volume, and you have particular magnitude of loudness, but it might be on continuum. Discrete messages still can probably have some analog projection you can gain. So, but these are ideas that I'm not really, I haven't developed, I haven't thought through that much. But definitely, in my case, in my thinking on the case, is that we have this combination of both helping each other, both almost kind of cross-fertilization, and probably in many cases that wouldn't be possible without the discrete, without the digital. Yeah.
Well, you need both. It's not one or the other.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Right, dualities rather than dualisms. We have another question, and once again, the chat box, wonderful to have people talking with each other. But if you have a question for Simeon, please put it in the Q&A box. So we have another anonymous question. I like your example of the experiential differences between analog versus digital clocks. Yet I don't see the digital clock as necessarily opening to the discrete, but to the now. But then I look now at my Apple Watch, which is displaying an analog clock. So as you say, it's hardly so simple. So maybe this was less of a question than trying to expand on the idea.
No, yeah, I'm very happy that this seemed to be gaining some traction with the audience, because I'm really thinking that there is something important here to capture, especially this relationship between the analog and the digital, and how technology, how digitalization probably transforms it. And definitely it's not a clear cut, right? There is a transformation, but it can be a useful way to explain, probably capture more the embodied. Yeah.
Great. And then we have another question from Kimberly. Thank you, Kimberly. What ways can be done, or what can perhaps we do to improve interactions within texts and emails to make more of a connection between people? So this sounds more like what could potentially be the practical ends. And the person goes on, Kimberly goes on, would training organizations on how to better communicate through these mediums help make more productive relationships in the workplace? Or would it have to be more spontaneous, such as dancing, like you said?
That's very good question. So I think for me, email is a very rich medium for interaction, right? So you don't have so much of a again, thinking about social media, Facebook, or Twitter, you have this kind of embedded functionalities to display, to explicitly like, or and again, going beyond, for instance, more symbolic engagements like using emojis and emote icons that is almost kind of is considered as a rule to convey particular emotions, to be more emotional in your communication. I think again, this meta-communicative analysis of, for instance, the speed, the length, can provide interesting patterns in a workplace. And when it was located in Germany, we tried to do analysis and see, so you can trace, for instance, power balances in a workplace by looking at the email communication, right? So you can see that the more important people, they would be responded much faster to, right? So there will be, and probably they wouldn't respond. So this would be, for instance, one sign of power relationships and power symmetries. You can, by analyzing these patterns of workplace communication, you can gain a lot of things there. You can see that, well, how could you interpret silences, or, for instance, a delay in response, or length. So you can, and all these are going beyond the discourse analysis, right? Not analyzing the content, but analyzing just the almost kind of the movements of the emails, thinking about the production of digital text. So even if you might be able to find and see when, for instance, an email is being developed, and when this email was written, and when it was sent. This might be also, if you could get to that, you can really gain a lot of insights from about the person on the other hand. And and then you can, on a email that has more people, you can see, and I think we all struggle somehow at Ask. We don't think so much about these things, but who you put first in the email, and there's some hierarchies, and and there's a lot of etiquette, and this might be also culturally determined. When I was working in Germany, it's very important. You should follow the pecking order. You should put probably the people with who are high in the organization first in the email. You cannot really exclude them. So I think there's it can, all these tacit gestures and ways that resonate, and they display things about our work relationships. We can gain a lot of that. So in terms of improving, I think people anyway adjust and they use emails in ways, but I think we can see signs of deficiencies in interaction, right? When you see, for instance, the changes from which might be just due to, for instance, a certain phase of a project, if people work on a project, but this might be very much signals for deteriorating relationships or engagement, intervention, and so on. I know, yeah. So it's a big topic, and I've been thinking about it, and I think it can be. It's in the age of big data, we have quantifying everything and datification. I think there is a lot of space here for workplace or communication analytics to try to see patterns and things that are not visible otherwise. Even you can have your own analysis of your own email interactions. When do you write emails? When do you send them? How much time you spent with some people on writing these emails? How much you kind of wait until you respond? All these things are very even for you, kind of analyzing, thinking about your own kind of personal practices might be very insightful. And again, this is not trying just this is reflecting our relationships with people that we have and how we develop them.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, and in response to Kimberly's question, it's not so much about, you know, here are some good guidelines or practices for better communication, but it's also not only, you know, it just has to be spontaneous. You know, there's this kind of attunement that you can perhaps cultivate in both yourself and in looking in the engagements with others to say, what are the dynamics going on here? How, you know, what's the tone like? What are the magnitudes? What you said, maybe I'll use your words in the paper that you sent me about it. You said something to the effect that I thought was really really interesting. We can't steer a pattern we're immersed in, but we can set its trajectory and momentum by being generous with our time and attention, especially in the beginning of the collaboration. So it's almost like a generosity and an attunement that we cultivate might be a way towards potentially better communications.
Yeah. So again, they can, but I think I have a number of practical suggestions how we can better communicate. But I'm not a big fan of this help books and right. So kind of I think we all develop some sort of tacit understanding of how technology works and how it very much. So, for instance, claims of techno stress. I don't buy really. The stress is not coming from the technology, it's coming from the relationship that it mediates or kind of helps us sustain or develop. But in this case, yes, so there are a number of different implications here. So one is, for instance, compared to more collocated and face-to-face interactions, there is a level of exaggeration here, something that we need to emphasize a bit more, because it might not be really visible to the other, or for instance, the speed of the response and how much we kind of show the diligence in our interaction. And you can see these things, but I don't think that people are so unskillful. There's a tacit understanding of the importance of these things, right? And when someone sends you an email, knowing that it's important to acknowledge the receipt, even if it's not in the form of acknowledgement, just thanking. And I think in the relationship, what I was thinking about, why is it that this relationship deteriorated in the second project? It seemed to be that this patterning, this dialogic interaction, which is very much about self and other, which is how we can perceive ourselves through the other, is a very circular movement, which are help for relationship to get into this vicious circle, right? So in the second project, by just being less engaged with the other, they were tempted to reciprocate. So there was this kind of vicious circle of disentangling of the patterns. And it seemed that what was really the problem there is that the more experienced, more skillful people are not, they just stepped out. They were not so much involved in the process. So they didn't project this kind of practices that seemed to be important to sustain the patterning and the engagement. And so in this case, it seemed that being more generous and being giving is something that really be reciprocated, right? Be kind of be responded. And so responsiveness, responsibility is a key here in this phenomenological notion of intercorporeality.
Thank you for that. So we've got a couple other questions, so I'll get right into them. The first one by an anonymous attendee, and I'm hoping I'm going to get these names right. How does your work intersect with post-phenomenologists like Don Eade and Peter Paul Verbeek? Do you know these?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I know them personally, actually.
Oh, okay. So you'll be able to speak to how your work intersects with them.
Okay. So I'm not post-phenomenologist. So I have this other paper that so Don Eade is basically developing a different relationship with technology, and so for instance, if some of these relationships and modes of engagement, they kind of focus on the body, right? And so some of these engagements might be when you put the glasses and kind of it's a direct embodied engagement, right? The glasses become part of you, or it can be just looking at the screen and seeing a map, and this map is almost kind of representation of the reality, so you kind of still detach from it. So they develop different relationships with the body, and I have another paper that looks at video conferencing that's trying to combine some of these ideas of Merleau-Ponty and Sartre of the mutual gazing, which is very much different context, right? Here we are talking about emails and digital text. In video conferencing, we are seeing each other. At the same time, I'm kind of, by your reaction, I'm judging how you're seeing me and how I'm being seen. And so this is kind of the body image. And this is, this mutual gazing is important, how we negotiate and how kind of we develop this intercorporeality, if you want. And I was looking at the emotions and anxieties in such meetings, and how people might use video conferencing technology to suppress or navigate different emotional experiences. So some of the examples there, again, sensitized by Don Eide's work, was that, for instance, you might, and we all know from the pandemic, actually, painfully, we know that arranging our backgrounds, and this is a background relationship with technology, and kind of, now kind of dimming the lights so that if it's a more anxious meeting, I again conducted very good interviews with people who were very open about their experiences and curating the background. And then there were aspects of, for instance, putting glasses or makeup and seeing each other in the screen, and how different was very different. So if we are more on the screen and we can see each other, it'd be very difficult to know who you're looking at and who you kind of exploring. And this is again adding to the anxiety, or some people would be just dimming their screens, which would be a different relationship with technology, so that they don't really see how they're being seen. And this was very interesting as well, because seeing someone also means that you're being seen, but when you dim the screen, this kind of diminishes the anxiety. So I think it's a complementary, and I'm kind of using this perspective with this relationships with technology. So I can share actually this paper if that might be interesting with Peter Paul Verbeek. I think he's more interested in the ethics. I think they're not so. What's distinctive here? Sorry, but I just didn't. What's distinctive about it? Most of their work is Don Eide and Peter Paul is that they're focused on not so much on the intersubjective interactions, right? They're more kind of human-computer interactions, how you deal with the technology. But what I'm trying to bring in here, this intercorporeality, where technology is becoming something constitutive condition of relationships, so in interactions with others. But I think they're definitely complementary. I think it's this perspective lent itself very nicely to capturing these emotional experiences and the circularity of mutual gazing.
Thank you for that. And that was something that you brought up in your talk too, this idea of the intercorporeality in the emails, we experience tension when people don't answer our emails. It's got nothing to do with missing information. It's got nothing to do with, I don't have the information I need. There's this tension. Why haven't they responded? So
it's a break in the pattern of awareness and probably even in a particular power asymmetries, it might be seen as so flexing muscles or signaling something else. So it's a very much a relational act.
Thank you. So we still have a couple more questions, so I'm going to get right back into them. Jillian has a question for you. Thank you so much. This is so interesting. I'm trying to think about your work in terms of clinical nursing and healthcare practice, and how the body materializes through healthcare technologies and informs our relationships. I think a simple example might be a cardiac heart monitor on a baby in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit. So not only the nurses look at the monitor to see how the baby's doing, but the parents pick up these gestures as well. So the monitor influences our caring practices. And this example, perhaps not the best way. Any thoughts? I thought that was a good example. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So it won't be exactly virtual. Virtual people are not co-present, but I think it's gonna this particular information, particular material object there would provide some information that you react, and I guess it requires a different reaction to sustain the usual relationship with the parents, right? So I don't know if that is something that might be relevant, but I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of the Zoom fatigue, right? So you have
yeah, I'm very familiar with that idea.
Okay.
I don't need to read that paper. Yeah.
So in that other paper, I was thinking that these ideas can help us have a different take on the Zoom fatigue, right? So if our ordinary mode of interaction with others is this mutual gazing, where I gain information and about myself through your gaze, and then I'm adjusting constantly my how I see myself and how I react, and kind of get a constant feedback. And this is almost kind of a circular movement. I'm kind of almost lost in it, right? It's something. It's the openness and the porousness of human beings, but with the opportunity to see myself at the same time, this circular movement becomes very much transformed. I'm looking at you, at your reaction, but at the same time looking at myself talking, which kind of diverts my attention and creates very difficult, kind of transforms my this very significant and fundamental mode of interacting with others in a situation of mutual gazing, right? And so my suggestion is that having this self-view while I'm talking is really a source of this fatigue. And so in this case, I think it's in the nursing example, I think it's something very similar, right? So you need to navigate a relationship with the patient, with the parents, at the same time you have this monitor which is providing information, which is being interpreted. So it's a very bodily. It solicits reactions from you, from the parents, and kind of reacting to their reactions of what's going on in the monitor. So I think this might take, again, I'm not sure if I'm really capturing, understanding very well the situation that was presented.
Well, I was going to, first of all, I know this experience. I'm not a NICU nurse, but I was an ICU nurse. This idea where you talk about gaze, we look at the monitors, and the monitor becomes a body just as much as the body becomes a body. And Jillian, I don't know, would you like to unmute yourself and engage in the conversation? You don't have to, but if you want to, please go ahead. she might not want to, which is fine as well. But that's, I'm wondering if that's what it is. If we think about it in terms of the gaze, and the monitor becomes something we look at and pay attention to, and it modifies what we do a lot. So I don't know if that maybe is the direction Jillian was going for. Oh, she's saying not sure she can unmute. Let me try to here, allow. Jillian, can you?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Okay. I think Miriam, you actually did a clear job of sort of asking about, I nearly wrote in the question that the monitor becomes the baby to a certain degree. And so I'm just sitting here sort of trying to, this is also interesting, and I'm just trying to sort of think about how we might, how your work, Dr. Vidolov, might help us in nursing practices to understand the way, and so like you say, so we can navigate, so we can negotiate these relationships to help us see what's happening with our bodies and with our relationships. Because what I just said, even that example is, I am a phenomenological researcher. I have a colleague in the NICU who's sort of done some research on this. I don't think in general NICU nurses are walking around thinking, oh yeah, that cardiac monitor sort of is like the baby. And so it's how to help us all as nurses to see what is happening in these relationships with and entanglements with technology, et cetera. So I appreciate your giving it a go. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's very, I think I have colleagues who worked and been trying to theorize a bit that area, where it's basically, so I think Baradian or even post-phenomenologists, they might suggest that this is an expansion of the physical body, right? It's this cardiac monitor. It's not just the representation, but it's almost kind of creation, which comes a new set of practices in addition to the probably ordinary mode of where you can essentially look at the patient and the child and touch or kind of see things that you don't really understand, how you can understand the condition of the patient, but you just through practice you have this sensual experience, what to look at, and this deified monitor there probably is just an addition, but and I think this colleague is suggesting that actually nurses become more important because with this deification of patients and the proliferation of evidence-based medicine, doctors are much more involved and looking at the data, and so much having this sensual sense and direct interactions with patients, which makes nurses much more essential to the process of engaging with the patients. But this is I don't know if that makes sense, but again, it's a bit of improvisational.
No, this is fantastic. I'm loving the conversation. So we have more questions, so I want to try and get to as many of them as possible. Another anonymous attendee asks, do you see digital technologies, say Zoom or Google Meet, disrupting ethical relationality? For example, Levinas's work.
Okay. No, yeah, I think there's definitely transformation, and I've been experiencing actually writing a paper on that topic of what it is to how we can deal with research ethics when it's conducted through digital technologies, right? And these digital technologies might be, on one hand, would require very different ethical considerations. For instance, the risks that one can cause to research respondents become very different. But the way we approach this issue is, and apparently Levinas is very kind of central to this idea of the responsibility for the other and so on. I think it's not going beyond that, but the digital technologies is transforming that in essential ways. It's creating new risks, new vulnerabilities, and requires a new kind of reconciliation of ethical practices. And again, I'm talking about research here, but I think it can be applicable to ethics more broadly, right? Ethical behaviors. So again, I can give example from research, which I've been thinking about a lot and been experiencing and struggling how to do. And you have nowadays we've been actually doing research. So in the context of type 1 diabetes community called We're Not Waiting, which is community that are hacking their own devices and developing closed loops, which is artificial pancreas, which helps significantly the lifestyle of patients and parents. And it's been so kind of conducting this, so on one hand, most of the people has been the founders of this community are in Silicon Valley. So we've been doing research through Zoom, and at the same time, you have a lot of data from Twitter. They have this kind of Twitter-based community. And so how you analyze, how you approach this data and all this, or participating in meetings that are online without, how do you, for instance, get permission to participate? You might ask, for instance, the people who are organizers to give you permission for research, but there are no established rules. What's ethical? How about if you can ask everyone who's participating, but what about people who join later? And all these kind of things that you can bring some harm to these people, and the way you collect data and is important, especially with big data. Or if you have this big data, it's anonymized and depersonalized, you can still, for instance, if you use, for instance, Twitter chats and Twitter tweets, this can be traced easily by just putting it there in Google and tracing it back to, you can easily identify them. So you can then just still keep the meaning of the tweet, but just shuffle a bit the wording so that it's not traceable. In all these things, it seems that digital technology is definitely transforming, requiring a different, more consideration of how we can act ethically and what is ethics, actually. Again, I think Bharat is very useful here to think about this ethical onto epistemology, that, so the way we kind of develop, collect data and how we analyze, it's not so much just epistemological, it's not just knowledge production, but it has its ontological, it's producing realities, producing worlds, which is always kind of ethical, it involves others. So yeah. But yeah, so the short answer is yes, and I think it's unfortunately Levinas is great, and I really like his work, but it seems that the digitalization requires a bit more kind of digging into this. I think this new materialism is important tool that we can further make sense in this. And again, I'm not suggesting everything's changed. It's a transformative, or it's everything or very discontinuous, but we need to also kind of acknowledge that there are changes that we need to react to.
Right. So while, I mean, disrupting ethical relationality, you could perhaps saying old forms of relationality are changing, and so our ethical perspectives need to change, but also it's creating new relationalities, and so we need to think about the ethics there as well, and what are the responsibilities with these new relationalities being constructed.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see it very easily in for instance, platforms like Twitter. You have so many communities, especially patient communities, that there's I think growing research in these patient communities, and you see people keeping together, and they have this massive or organized mass of people who it changes, and there is a bit of attrition, people coming and going. But this platform doesn't allow for much of development of relationships. You have people that you follow and you get followed, And it's a very different relationship from what you might have a collocated patient group, right? Where you kind of really experience in a very different relationship. So very different relationalities, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And new and novel ones. And so we're always having to work in real time, figuring out what our responsibilities are, which perhaps goes back to that question about what would be better communication. You know, you can't prescribe it ahead of time, but you can, you can attune to this idea that we are in this creative process.
Yes, and also you can see the fundamental ways of how we, for instance, mobilize and organize ourselves, and how we kind of behave, we develop socialities are very different. And there are these claims that this idea of collective action is not really working well, because it's a very decentralized, right? It's more of a connective action where people are not explicitly getting a mutual understanding and agreeing to do something together, but it's becoming in a much more decentralized, distributed way where your actions somehow align with those of others. And this is also many of these patient movements are how they are working. They're not necessarily kind of very consciously intentional and regulated and steered by a center, but it's much more emergent.
Right, exactly. We do have another question. We have 3 minutes left, and I do want to at least ask it. Kirk asks us, is there a device that integrates EKG and EEG, electrocardiogram and electroencephalograms, for a larger, quote, automatic view of patient status while in the hospital bed? Would that take some of the joy out of nursing? I could say, sounds to me like it would just add to the stress of nursing, but any response to that? It does sound like a more nursing specific question, but this idea of technology is providing automatic views of status, that might be something intriguing to think through. Again, this idea of information versus dynamics.
I hope this question is not for me.
Maybe not. And anyway, we okay, I don't like automatic personally. Yeah, okay. So it sounds as if there's these ideas of how we orient what we consider healthcare technologies, like, like an EKG monitor providing a representation of heart rates and things of that nature. And I think you've spoken to that in terms of that information being information received, but then we're trying to work through the complexities of, okay, well, what else does that monitor do besides?
Yes, and I think I actually mentioned and promised to talk a bit about immersive and augmented realities and technologies that seem to be the future. So I don't know how this might work out and transform nursing practice, but I think this is a very uncharted territory. Yeah. As far as I know, in my university, there is some training in the School of Nursing through augmented and immersive devices. But it's a very interesting area for me, to what degree, for instance, this idea of intercorporeality can be applied here, because you are immersed through avatar, which you can navigate, but then it becomes a much more schizophrenic relationship of how you perceive the image of the other and how he or she perceives your avatar, and how this relates to your lived experiences seems to be a completely much more layered and complex behaviors, which would be very interesting to explore in future.
I agree. It's always more complex than we originally anticipate or want or desire. And I think on that note, it is 11:30. I'm going to go ahead and close our session. I want to thank you, Simeon, so much for this really, really, really engaging and stimulating conversation. I think highly relevant to nursing. Thank you for agreeing to come on board and talk. Thank you to all the attendees who listened and have questions. The recording will be available in about a week, and we will go ahead and send that out to you. So thank you again, Simeon. Really appreciate you.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for having me. And thank you
coming
for
here.
the questions. Thank you.
Okay, bye.